Chapter 4, Part 1. So great is the heat that the dust rises. The Song of Roland. During the next 3 weeks, the Allied troops made small advances in parts of the lines held by them at Anzac and Cape Helles. Fighting was continuous in both zones. There was always much, and sometimes intense, artillery fire. The Turks frequently attacked in force, sometimes in very great force, but were repulsed. Our efforts were usually concentrated on some redoubt, stronghold, or salient in the nearer Turkish lines, the fire from which galled our trenches or threatened any possible advance. These posts were either heavily bombarded and then rushed under the cover of a feu de barrage, or carried by surprise attack. Great skill and much dashing courage were shown in these assaults. The emplacements of machine guns were seized and the guns destroyed. Dangerous trenches or parts of trenches were carried and filled in, and many roosts or hiding places of snipers were made untenable. These operations were on a small scale and were designed to improve the position then held by us, rather than to carry the whole line further up the peninsula. Sometimes they failed, but by far the greater number succeeded, so that by these methods, eked out by ruses, mines, clever invention, and the most daredevil bravery, parts of our lines were advanced by more than 100 yards. On the 4th of June, a second great attack was made by the Allied troops near Cape Helles. Like the attack of the 6th to 8th May, it was an advance of the whole line, from the straits to the sea, against the enemy's front-line trenches. As before, the French were on the right and the 29th Division on the left, but between them in this advance were the RN Division and the newly arrived 42nd Division. Our men advanced after a prolonged and terrible bombardment, which so broke down the Turk defense that the works were carried all along the line, except in one place on the left of the French sector and in one other place on our own left near the sea. Our advance, as before, varied in depth from a quarter of a mile to 600 yards, all of it carried by a rush in a short time, owing to the violence of the artillery preparation, though with heavy losses from shrapnel and machine gun fire. In this attack, the 42nd or East Lancashire Division received its baptism of fire. Even those who had seen the men of the 29th Division in the battles for the landing admitted that nothing could have been finer than the extreme gallantry of these newly landed men. The Manchester Brigade and 2 companies of the 5th Lancashire Fusiliers advanced with the most glorious and dashing courage, routed the Turks, carried both their lines of trenches, and 1 battalion, the 6th, very nearly carried the village of Krithia. There was, in fact, no entrenched line between them and the top of Achi Baba. But in this campaign we were to taste and be upon the brink of victory in every battle, yet have the prize dashed from us by some failure elsewhere each time. So in this first rush, when for the first time our men felt that they, not the Turks, were the real attackers, the victory was not to remain with us. We had no high explosive shell and not enough shrapnel shell to deny to the Turks the use of their superior numbers and to hold them in a beaten state. They rallied and made strong counterattacks, especially upon a redoubt or earth fortress called the Haricot, on the left of the French sector, which the French had stormed an hour before and garrisoned with Senegalese troops. The Turks heavily shelled this work and then rushed it. The Senegalese could not hold it, the French could not support it, and the Turks won it. Unfortunately, the Haricot enfiladed the lines we had won. In a little while, the Turks developed from it a deadly enfilade fire upon the RN Division, which had won the Turk trenches to the west of it. The RN Division was forced to fall back, and in doing so, uncovered the right of the brigade of Manchesters beyond it to the westward. The Manchesters were forced to give ground. The French were unable to make a new attack upon the Haricot, so that by nightfall our position was less good than it had been at 12:30. But for the fall of the Haricot, the day would have been a notable victory for ourselves. Still, over 3 miles of the Allied front, our lines had been pushed forward from 200 to 400 yards. This in modern war is a big advance, but it brings upon the conquerors a very severe labor of digging. The trenches won from the defense have to be converted to the uses of the attack and linked up by saps and communication trenches with the works from which the attack advanced. All this labor had to be done by our men in the midst of bitter fighting, for the Turks fought hard to win back these trenches in many bloody counterattacks, and, as always happened, after each advance, outlying works and trenches from which fire could be brought to bear upon the newly won ground had to be carried, filled in, or blown up before the new line was secure. A little after dawn on the 21st June, the French stormed and won the Haricot redoubt and advanced the right of the Allied position by 600 yards. The Turkish counterattacks were bloodily defeated. In the forenoon of the 28th June, the English divisions advanced the left of the Allied position by a full 1,000 yards. This attack, which was one of the most successful of the campaign, was the first of which it could be said that it was a victory. Of course, our presence upon the peninsula was in itself a victory, but in this battle we were not trying to land nor to secure ourselves, but, for the first time, to force a decision. 3 of our divisions challenged the greater part of the Turk army and beat it. And here, for the first time in the operations, we felt what all our soldiers had expected, that want of fresh men in reserve to make a success decisive, which afterwards lost us the campaign. Our enemies have often said that the English cannot plan nor execute an attack. In this battle of June 28th, the attack was a perfect piece of planning and execution. Everything was exactly timed. Everything worked smoothly. 10,000 soldiers, not one of whom had had more than 6 months' training, advanced uphill after an artillery preparation and won 2 lines of elaborately fortified trenches by the bayonet alone. Then, while these men consolidated and made good the ground which they had won, the artillery lengthened their fuses and bombarded the ground beyond them. When the artillery ceased, 10,000 fresh soldiers climbed out of the English lines, ran forward, leaped across the 2 lines of Turk trench already taken, and took 3 more lines of trench, each line a fortress in itself. Besides advancing our position 1,000 yards, this attack forced back the right of the Turks from the sea and won a strong position between the sea and Krithia, almost turning Achi Baba. But much more than this was achieved. The great triumph of the day was the certainty then acquired that the Turks were beaten, that they were no longer the fierce and ardent fighters who had rushed V Beach in the dark, but a shaken company who had caught the habit of defeat and might break at any moment. They were beaten. We had beaten them at every point, and they knew that they were beaten. Every man in the French and British lines knew that the Turks were at the breaking point. We had only to strike while the iron was hot to end them. As happened afterwards, after the Battle of August, we could not strike while the iron was hot. We had not the men nor the munitions. Had the 50,000 men who came there in July and August but been there in June, our men could have kept on striking. But they were not there in June, and our victory of the 28th could not be followed up. More than a month passed before it could be followed up. During that month, the Turks dug themselves new fortresses, brought up new guns, made new stores of ammunition, and remade their army. Their beaten troops were withdrawn and replaced by the very pick and flower of the Turkish Empire. When we attacked again, we found a very different enemy. The iron was cold. We had to begin again from the beginning. 36 hours after our June success, at midnight in the night of June 29th to 30th, the Turks made a counterattack, not at Cape Helles, where their men were shaken, but at Anzac, where perhaps they felt our menace more acutely. A large army of Turks, about 30,000 strong, ordered by Enver Pasha to drive the foreigners into the sea or never to look upon his face again, attacked the Anzac position under cover of the fire of a great artillery. They were utterly defeated with a loss of about a quarter of their strength, some 7,000 to 8,000 killed and wounded. All this fighting proved clearly that the Turks, with all their power of fresh men, Their closeness to their reserves and their superior positions could not beat us from what we had secured, nor keep us from securing more. Our advance into the peninsula, though slow and paid for with much life, was sure and becoming less slow. What we had won, we had fought hard for and never ceased to fight hard for, but we had won it and could hold it, and with increasing speed add to it, and the Turks knew this as well as we did. But early in May, something happened which had a profound result upon the course of the operations. It is necessary to write of it at length, if only to show the reader that this Dardanelles campaign was not a war in itself, but a part of a war involving most of Europe and half of Asia, and that being so, it was affected by events in other parts of the war, as deeply as it affected those parts in turn by its own events. No one of the many who spoke to me about the campaign knew or understood that the campaign as planned was not to be solely a French and English venture, but, in its later stages, a double attack upon the Turkish power by ourselves on the peninsula and the Hellespont, and by the Russians on the shores of the Black Sea. The double attack, threatening Turkey at the heart, was designed to force the Turks to divide their strength, and by causing uneasiness among the citizens, to keep in and about Constantinople a large army which might otherwise wreck our Mesopotamian expedition, threaten India and Egypt, and prevent the Grand Duke Nicholas from advancing from the Caucasus on Erzurum. But as the Polish campaign developed adversely to Russia, it became clear that it would be impossible for her to give the assistance she had hoped. Early in May, Sir Ian Hamilton learned that his advance, instead of being a part of a concerted scheme, was to be the only attack upon the Turks in that quarter, and that he would have to withstand the greater part of the Turkish army. This did not mean that the Turks could mass an overwhelming strength against any part of his positions, since in the narrow peninsula there is not room for great numbers to maneuver, but it meant that the Turks would have always within easy distance great reserves of fresh men to take the place of those exhausted, and that without a correspondingly great reserve, we had little chance of decisive success. This change in the strategical scheme was made after we were committed to the venture. It made a profound difference to our position. Unfortunately, we were so deeply engaged in other theaters that it was impossible to change our plans as swiftly and as profoundly as our chances. The Great Reserve could not be sent when it became necessary early in May, nor for more than 2 months. Until it came, it happened time after time that even when we fought and beat back the Turks, they could be reinforced before we could. All through the campaign we fought them and beat them back, but always, on the day after the battle, they had a division of fresh men to put into the defense, while we, who had suffered more, being the attackers, had but a handful with which to follow up the success. People have said, but you could have kept fresh divisions in reserve as easily as the Turks. Why did you not send more men, so as to have them ready to follow up a success? I could never answer this question. It is the vital question. The cry for 50,000 more men and plenty of high explosive went up daily from every trench in Gallipoli, and we lost the campaign through not sending them in time. On the spot, of course, our generals knew that war, like life, consists of a struggle with the disadvantages, and their struggle with these was a memorable one. Only, when all was done, their situation remained that of the Frank rearguard in the Song of Roland. In that poem, the Franks could and did beat the Saracens, but the Saracens brought up another army before the Franks were reinforced. The Franks could and did beat that army too, but the Saracens brought up another army before the Franks were reinforced. The Franks could and did beat that army too, but then they were spent, and Roland had to sound his horn, and Charlemagne would not come to the summons of the horn, and the heroes were abandoned in the dolorous pass. Summer came upon Gallipoli with a blinding heat only comparable to New York in July. The flowers which had been so gay with beauty in the Hellas fields in April soon wilted to stalks. The great slope of Cape Helles took on a savage and African look of desolation. The air quivered over the cracking land. In the blueness of the heat haze, the graceful, terrible hills looked even more gentle and beautiful than before, and one who was there said that there were little birds that droned, rather like the English yellowhammers. With the heat, which was a new experience to all the young English soldiers there, came a plague of flies beyond all record and belief. Men ate and drank flies. The filthy insects were everywhere. The ground in places was so dark with them that one could not be sure whether the patches were ground or flies. Our camps and trenches were kept clean. They were well scavenged daily, but only a few yards away were the Turk trenches, which were invariably filthy. There the flies bred undisturbed, perhaps encouraged. There is a fine modern poem which speaks of the Indian sun in summer as the blazing Death Star. Men in Gallipoli, in the summer of 1915, learned to curse the sun as an enemy more cruel than the Turk. With the sun and the plague of flies came the torment of thirst, one of the greatest torments which life has the power to inflict. At Cape Helles in the summer, there was a shortage but no great scarcity of water, for the Turk wells supplied more than half the army, and less than half the water needed had to be brought from abroad. At Anzac, however, there was always a scarcity, for even in the spring not more than a third of the water needed could be drawn from wells. At first, water could be found by digging shallow pans in the beach, but this method failed when the heats began. 2/3 or more of the water needed at Anzac had always to be brought from abroad, and to bring this 2/3 regularly and to land it and store it under shell fire was a difficult task. When operations were on, as in the August battle, the difficulty of distribution was added to the other difficulties, and then indeed want of water brought our troops to death's door. At Anzac, when operations were on, even in the intensest heat, the average ration of water for all purposes was, perhaps at most, a pint and a half, sometimes only a pint. And though this extremity was as a rule only reached when operations were on, when there was heavy fighting, it was then that the need was greatest. In peace, in comfortable homes, in cool weather, civilized people need or consume a little less than 3 pints of liquid in each day. In hot weather, and when doing severe bodily labor, they need more, perhaps half a gallon in the day. Thirst, which most of us know solely as a pleasant zest to drinking, soon becomes a hardship, then, in an hour, an obsession, and by high noon, a madness to those who toil in the sun with nothing to drink. Possibly to most of the many thousands who were in the peninsula last summer, the real enemies were not the Turks, but the sun in heaven, shaking the pestilence of his light, and thirst that withered the heart and cracked the tongue. Some have said to me, yes, but the Turks must have suffered too, just as much in that waterless ground. It is not so. The Turks at Cape Helles held the wells at Krithia. Inland from Anzac, they held the wells near Lonesome Pine and Koja Deer. They had other wells at Medos and Gallipoli. They had always more water than we, and, what is more, the certainty of it. Most of them came from lands with little water and great heat, 10 or more degrees further to the south than any part of England. Heat and thirst were old enemies to them. They were tempered to them. Our men had to serve an apprenticeship to them and pay for what they learned in bodily hardship. Not that our men minded hardship. They did not. They were volunteers who had chosen their fate and were there of their own choice. And no army in the world has ever faced suffering more cheerily. But this hardship of thirst was a weight upon them. Throughout the summer, like malaria, it did not kill, but it lowered all vitality. It halved the possible effort of men always too few for the work in hand. Let it now double the honor paid to them. In the sandy soil of the peninsula were many minute amoeba, which played their part in the summer suffering. In the winds of the great droughts of July and August, the dust blew about our positions like smoke from burning hills. It fell into food and water and was eaten and drunk, like the flies, at each meal. Within the human body, the amoeba of the sand set up symptoms like those of dysentery, as a rule slightly less severe than the true dysentery of camps. After July, nearly every man in our army in Gallipoli suffered from this evil. Like the thirst, it lowered more vitality than it destroyed. Many died, it is true, but then nearly all were ill. It was the universal sickness, not the occasional death, that mattered. Pass now to the position of affairs at the end of June. We were left to our own strength in this struggle. The Turks were shaken. It was vital to our chances to attack again before they recovered. We had not the men to attack again, but they were coming and were due in a few weeks' time. While they were on their way, the question, how to use them, was considered. End of section 7.